To the outside world, my family was the picture of quiet dignity. We were the Gables of Harmony Creek, a name that meant respectable tradition, sensible shoes, and polite smiles that never quite reached the eyes. But I recently found out that this calm facade was a carefully built lie designed to hide a 40-year-old secret. They used their silence like a weapon to disown my mother, and they almost got away with it. They just never imagined I would find the letter she left behind. My name is Clara. For most of my life, I was just a character in their pristine storybook, the quiet daughter of the willful child. The Gables were pillars of our small town, their lives built on unspoken rules and a veneer of perfect decorum. At the head of it all was my grandmother, Eleanor Gable, the matriarch who conducted our lives with the subtle, commanding flick of a wrist. Her approval was the sun we all orbited. Her disapproval was a chilling, permanent winter. Even as a kid, I felt the cold drafts in our family's grand home. There was always a polite distance in their hugs, a hollowness behind the pleasantries at Sunday dinner. It was a feeling I could never quite name, a nagging sense that I was just a little out of step with the perfect picture they presented. I felt it most when I thought of my mother, Sarah. She passed away 5 years ago, leaving me with a handful of fragmented memories and a deep, lingering sadness. In the Gable family story, my mother was a footnote, a brief, rebellious chapter they had politely closed. They just say she had chosen a different life, always with a sigh of gentle disappointment. But now I know the truth. The silence wasn't about dignity, it was about erasure, and their quiet life wasn't peaceful. It was the muffled sound of a buried truth screaming to be heard. Harmony Creek is the kind of small American town where history isn't just recorded, it's soaked into the soil. The Gable family had been rooted in that soil for a century. Our ancestral home, a stately white colonial with black shutters, was a monument to their long-lasting presence. It was a house of hushed footsteps on polished floors, antique furniture draped in dust sheets, and memories that were curated as carefully as the family silver. After my grandmother Eleanor passed, the heavy task of sorting through the 90 years of her life fell to me. My mother Sarah was her only child to have a child. My great-aunt Carol, Eleanor's younger sister, was too frail. So the attic, a dusty home for a century of Gable history, became my job. The air up there was thick with the smell of dried lavender and old paper. Sunbeams, heavy with dancing dust, cut through the gloom, lighting up stacks of forgotten treasures and discarded lives. For days, I waded through a sea of nostalgia, moth-eaten wedding dresses, leather-bound photo albums, and boxes of my grandfather's old woodworking tools. It felt less like cleaning and more like an archaeological dig. I almost missed it. Tucked away in the dark eaves, behind a stack of old newspapers from the 1980s, was a small, plain wooden box. It wasn't fancy like the other family heirlooms. It was simple, functional, and locked. Curiosity, a trait the Gables didn't exactly encourage, got the better of me. Using the tip of a rusted screwdriver, I managed to jimmy the simple lock open. Inside, resting on faded velvet, was a bundle of letters tied with a brittle silk ribbon. Most were from various suitors to a young Eleanor, written in a flourishing, hopeful script. But one was different. It was a single envelope, creased and yellowed with age, addressed to my grandmother. The return address was a P.O. box in a city 3 states away, but it was the handwriting that made my breath catch. I knew that elegant, slightly slanted cursive. It was my mother's. The postmark was dated 40 years ago, but the envelope hadn't been sealed by my mother. It had been neatly sliced open at the top, like with a letter opener. As I unfolded the single sheet of paper inside, I realized this wasn't a letter that had been received and cherished. This was evidence. This was the start of everything. The letter was a plea, a desperate, heartbreaking appeal from a daughter to her mother. It was the beginning of the end of the lie. The attic, with all its ghosts, seemed to hold its breath as I read. The words on the page weren't just ink, they were a raw cry from a past I never knew. My mother's voice, which I'd only known in its later years to be tinged with a quiet sadness, was suddenly vibrant, desperate, and full of a love that had been forbidden. I am writing to you one last time, praying you'll find it in your heart to listen. I know what you think of James. I know you can't see past the color of his skin to the goodness of his heart, the strength of his character, the way he makes me feel seen and loved for the first time in my life. You say this will bring shame to the family, but the only shame I feel is knowing my own mother would ask me to betray the man I love. You talk about duty and appearances, about what people in Harmony Creek will whisper. But what about love? What about happiness? I'm not asking for the world. I'm asking for you to see me, to see us. I keep thinking about what Papa wanted. He always told me my heart was my truest compass and made me promise I'd follow it no matter where it led. You're ignoring his wishes, Mother. You're twisting his memory to fit your own fears. He would have loved James. He would have celebrated our joy. I go to the old oak tree sometimes, the one on the edge of the property. I remember the promises Papa and I made there. He promised me that this land, this home, was as much mine as anyone's. He promised I would always have a place here. Are you going to break his promise too? Please reconsider. Don't make me choose between my family and the man who is my future. Our future. I love him, and I am carrying his child, your grandchild. The letter ended there without a signature, as if her hand had been trembling too much to write her own name. A child, me asterisk, I was the child. The world just tilted. My reality, built on the clean, sanitized stories of the Gable family, crumbled. My mother hadn't just left, she had been pushed out. My father, a man I never knew, a complete blank in my history, wasn't just some brief relationship. He was a great love, and he was a black man. Every sad smile my mother had ever given me, every far-off look in her eyes, every time she seemed to be listening to a song only she could hear, it all snapped into focus. She didn't just have a quiet personality, it was the quiet of a deep, unresolved grief. The polite family narrative was a vicious, calculated lie that had erased my father and sentenced my mother to a life of exile. The letter mentioned what Papa wanted. My grandfather, Thomas Gable, died a year before this letter was written. He was just a figure in old, sepia-toned photos to me, a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. My mother had adored him. The letter was my first real clue. My investigation had begun. The first step was clear. I had to talk to someone who was there, someone who watched the lie take root. I needed to see my great-aunt Carol. Aunt Carol lived in a small, perfect cottage on the other side of town, like a miniature version of the Gable home, filled with porcelain dolls and the smell of potpourri. She was Aliner's younger sister, the softer, more fragile of the two. If Aliner was steel, Carol was lace. I found her in her sunroom tending to her African violets. She greeted me with the usual feather-like kiss on the cheek. Her eyes, pale blue and clouded with age, held a familiar, watery kindness. I decided to start gently, to circle the truth before dropping it in the middle of the room. Aunt Carol, I began, taking the cup of weak tea she offered. I've been going through Grandma's things in the attic. It's brought up a lot of memories of Mom. Carol's hands stilled over a flower. Ah, Sarah, she sighed, the sound practiced and smooth. She was always so willful, a free spirit, not like the rest of us. There it was. The first brick in the wall of the family story, the official line. Willful, I pressed, keeping my voice steady. Or just different. I found some of her old things. It seems like she was very happy here for a while. We were all happy, Carol said a little too quickly. She wouldn't meet my eyes, her attention suddenly fixed on a speck of dust on a china saucer. I was thinking about the old oak tree at the edge of the property, I said, watching her face. Mom used to take me there when we'd visit. She never said why, but it seemed important to her. A flicker of something, fear maybe, crossed her face before it went blank again. Oh, it's just a tree, dear. Children love to climb trees. The wall was thicker than I thought. Time for a new tactic. There was another piece of the puzzle that was bothering me, a family heirloom. You know, I said casually, I was looking for Grandma Aliner's silver locket, the one she always wore. I couldn't find it in her jewelry box. She always said it was special, that it would be passed down. Carol stood up and started fussing with the curtains, her back to me. Lost, I imagine. Your grandmother was getting forgetful in her final years. Things get misplaced. Her voice was tight, brittle. She was lying. The dismissal was too quick, the explanation too neat. The locket, the tree, my mother's past, it was all connected, and Aunt Carol was standing guard over a history she helped bury. I knew right then that gentle questions weren't going to cut it. I needed proof. Something that couldn't be explained away as a misplaced memory or a childish fantasy. The letter mentioned my grandfather's wishes. That meant a will, and a will was a public record. Leaving Aunt Carol with her violets and her carefully pruned memories, I drove to the county courthouse, a place of hard facts and documented truth. I wasn't just sorting through an old house anymore. I was excavating a crime scene. The Harmony Creek County Courthouse was a big brick building that smelled of floor wax and old paper. The records room was in the basement, a fluorescent-lit cavern of rolling metal shelves. I felt a nervous tremor as I requested the file for Thomas Gable's last will and testament. This was real, no turning back now. The clerk, a woman with a stern bun and glasses perched on her nose, came back with a thin, brittle folder. I took it to a small desk and opened it with shaky hands. At first glance, my grandfather's will was straightforward. He had been a fair man. His assets, including the valuable family property, were to be divided equally between my mother, Sarah, and her Aunt Carol, managed by his wife, Eleanor, as the executor until she passed away. But then, I saw the clause. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read it. Should my beloved daughter, Sarah Gable, continue to reside on the family property at the time of her mother Eleanor's death, her portion of the inheritance shall be increased to 60% of the total estate. It is my deepest wish that she always considers this house her home. It was a tether, a loving legal anchor to ensure my mother's place in the family. He knew, my grandfather must have known about his wife's prejudices. He had tried to protect his daughter from beyond the grave, but my hope didn't last long. Tucked behind the will was another document, a codicil, an amendment. It was dated 6 months after my grandfather's death. In cold, stark legal terms, it stated that Sarah Gable, of her own free will, had relinquished all claims to the family estate. In exchange, she had been given a one-time payment of $5,000. $5,000 for a birthright worth hundreds of thousands. It was signed by Eleanor as executor, and at the bottom, in a shaky script that looked nothing like her usual elegant hand, was my mother's signature, Sarah Gable. It was a signature made under pressure. I could feel it. The desperate letter I'd found was written just weeks before this. A woman begging to be accepted wouldn't suddenly walk away for a pittance. She was forced. The courthouse gave me the skeleton of the truth. Now I needed its soul. My next stop was the only other institution in Harmony Creek as old as the Gable family, the First Presbyterian Church. Reverend Michael had been the pastor there for 50 years. His face was a road map of kindness, his hair a soft white crown. I found him arranging hymnals in the empty sanctuary. He remembered my mother instantly. A genuine, warm smile lit his face. "Sarah," he said, his voice soft. Oh, she was a bright light in this church, full of life, full of questions. A wonderful artist, too. She painted the backdrop for the Christmas pageant for years. My throat tightened. These were the details scrubbed from the family history. "Reverend," I began, my voice unsteady, "I'm trying to understand what happened, why she left." The pastor's smile faded. He looked down at the hymnal in his hands. "There are things a pastor hears, Clara, things kept in confidence, but 40 years is a long time for a hurt to fester." He hesitated, then went on. "There was a misunderstanding," he said, choosing his words carefully. "A difficult situation. Your grandmother, Eleanor, was a very proud woman, a very formidable woman. She believed she was protecting the family's name." He took a deep breath. "She stood before the congregation, right where you're standing now, and announced that Sarah had been given a wonderful opportunity in the city, that she had decided to renounce her inheritance to pursue a life unburdened by family obligations. Eleanor framed it as a noble sacrifice." He finally looked at me, his eyes full of a deep, ancient sadness. "It was presented as a way to save face, to prevent gossip, but I always wondered. Sarah loved this town, she loved her father. It never felt right." The pieces clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a family secret, it was a public performance, a lie told to an entire town from the pulpit of their church. My grandmother hadn't just disowned her daughter, she had rewritten her character, turning her into a cautionary tale. The betrayal was deeper and more public than I could have ever imagined. I drove back to Aunt Carol's with a cold, clear purpose. The time for gentle questions was over. I wasn't a curious granddaughter anymore. I was an arbiter for a long-delayed justice. I found her right where I had left her in the sunroom, but the calm look was gone. Her face was pale and drawn, as if she'd been wrestling with ghosts. I didn't say a word. I walked to the small table between us and placed the documents on it, one by one. First, my mother's yellowed letter, then the copy of my grandfather's will with his loving clause highlighted. And finally, the cold, cruel codicil that signed her life away. Aunt Carol stared at the papers like they were snakes. A low, wounded sound escaped her lips, a sound that had been trapped for 40 years. Her composure shattered and she began to weep, not the delicate, ladylike tears of a Gable woman, but racking, guttural sobs of guilt. "I knew you'd find out one day," she whispered, her voice ragged. "I told her. I told Alina a secret that big couldn't be buried forever." And then the whole story came pouring out. Alina, a woman forged in the rigid social codes of her generation, had been horrified when Sarah fell in love with James. In her eyes, it wasn't just a bad match, it was a stain on the family's reputation. She forbade the relationship, but Sarah, for the first time in her life, refused. When Alina found out Sarah was pregnant, she saw her control slipping. So she used the most powerful weapon she had, her position as executor of her husband's will. She gave Sarah an ultimatum: sign away the inheritance, leave town, and never contact James again, or Alina would use the family's influence to ruin him. She threatened to spread vicious rumors, get him fired, and make his life in their small town impossible. It was a threat she was more than capable of carrying out. Sarah was terrified, Carol sobbed, her face in her hands. Not for herself, but for him, for you. She thought she was protecting you both. She signed the papers, took the $5,000, and walked away from everything. Your father, James, he never knew. Sarah told him she couldn't live with the pressure, that she didn't love him enough to fight. She broke his heart to save his life. Alina then performed her public lie, crafting the story of the ambitious daughter. The entire family, including Carol, was sworn to secrecy. They became silent accomplices. "I was weak," Carol said, her voice barely a whisper. "I was afraid of her, we all were. The silence, it was just easier than fighting her." After a long moment, she looked up at me, her eyes red and pleading. "But Alina, she lived with the ghost of it. I think it broke something inside her, too." She rose slowly and went to a small desk in the corner. From a locked drawer, she pulled out a small velvet pouch. "She gave this to me a week before she died," Carol explained, her hands shaking. "She said, 'Give this to Clara when the time is right.' It was her mother's." Inside was the silver locket. It was heavy in my palm. It was the one piece of my grandmother I'd always associated with some secret warmth. I clicked open the tiny clasp. Instead of a photo, there was a tiny, intricately folded piece of paper. I carefully unfolded it. The handwriting was my grandfather's. It wasn't a will or a legal document. It was a note, a secret promise from a father to his daughter. It read, "The oak tree holds my real promise to you. Never forget your worth." The locket wasn't a trophy for Alina to wear. It was meant for Sarah. It was my grandfather's final, loving act of defiance. He had been trying to speak to her and to me across the decades. The real promise wasn't about property or money. It was about worth, a worth my grandmother had tried and failed to extinguish. Holding the locket, the full weight of the last 40 years settled on me. This was more than a disinheritance. It was a cruel, systematic erasure. They had stolen my mother's birthright, her truth, her love, her voice, and my father. The family betrayal was absolute. They had left my mother with nothing but a broken heart and a secret she had to carry to her grave. I walked out of Aunt Carol's and drove back to the Gable home, the locket a cold weight in my pocket. I went straight to the old oak tree at the edge of the property. It was immense, a giant watching over the fields. I had played under this tree as a child, my mother watching me with that familiar, distant sadness in her eyes. Now I understood. This wasn't just a tree, it was a memorial to a love story that was never allowed to be told. Leaning against its rough bark, I thought about my grandfather's real promise. Was it a hidden stash of money, a secret deed? It didn't matter. The promise wasn't financial, it was existential. It was a father telling his daughter that her worth wasn't determined by her mother's approval or the town's judgment. her worth was inherent, as strong and deep-rooted as this tree. That was the inheritance Alina could never touch. My mind was racing. The family was planning a formal memorial for Alina at the church that weekend. It was supposed to be the final, polished chapter in the legend of the Gable matriarch. The whole town would be there to pay their respects, to hear eulogies about her grace and her unwavering commitment to her family. The irony was suffocating. They were planning to honor a woman's legacy by repeating the very lie that legacy was built on. For a second, I thought about letting it go, walking away just like my mother did, keeping the peace. That was the Gable way, but as I looked up at the sprawling branches of the oak, I knew I couldn't. My mother chose silence to protect the man she loved. I had to choose to speak to protect her memory. The justice she deserved wasn't about money or land, it was moral, it was the restoration of her story, and it had to be public. The family expected me, the quiet granddaughter, to say a few polite sentences about my grandmother's knitting and her prize-winning roses. They had no idea I was about to set their perfectly manicured world on fire. Not with rage, but with truth. On the day of the memorial, the First Presbyterian Church was full. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and quiet grief. I sat in the front pew with the family, a composed figure in a simple black dress. One by one, people walked to the pulpit to share their memories of Alina Gable. They spoke of her dignity, her strength, her grace. They painted a portrait of a saint, a pillar of the community. With each eulogy, the lie grew bigger, more suffocating. My family sat beside me, their faces masks of solemn remembrance, totally unaware of the reckoning to come. Finally, Reverend Michael looked to our pew. "And now, we'll hear from Alina's granddaughter, Clara." A polite, expectant hush fell over the church. I felt my great-aunt Carol's hand tremble next to me. I gave it a gentle squeeze. I walked to the pulpit, my steps steady. I placed my mother's letter and the silver locket on the wooden lectern. I looked out at the sea of faces, my family, their friends, the townspeople who had unknowingly been part of the lie for 4 decades. I began, my voice clear and calm. "I'm here today to speak about my grandmother, Alina Gable, and her legacy. To the world, and even to me for most of my life, my family was the picture of quiet grace. But I've learned that this quiet wasn't always a sign of peace. Sometimes silence is a weapon." A nervous cough came from the front pew. My uncle shifted in his seat. 40 years ago, I continued, my mother Sarah fell in love. His name was James. He was a good and honorable man. He was also a black man, and in my grandmother's eyes, that was a sin the family's reputation could not bear. A collective gasp swept through the church. The air crackled with shock. I want to share with you the truth of my mother's departure from Harmony Creek. It was not a willful choice to abandon her family. It was an act of exile. I picked up the letter. This is a letter my mother wrote to my grandmother, begging for an acceptance that never came. I didn't read the whole thing. I didn't need to. I read the most important lines, my mother's voice echoing through the sacred space she had been cast out of. I spoke of her love for James, of her pregnancy with me, and of her heartbreak. Then I told them about the will, about my grandfather's loving attempt to protect his daughter. And I told them about the coercion and the $5,000 paid for a lifetime of silence. My grandmother stood at this very pulpit and told this congregation a story, I said, my voice unwavering. A story about a daughter who renounced her family, but that wasn't the truth. The truth is, my mother was the victim of a terrible injustice led by the woman we are here to honor today. I held up the locket. The justice I seek today is not financial. It's not about property. It is about restoring a story that was stolen. My mother, Sarah, didn't live a life of noble sacrifice for her career. She lived a life of profound strength. The strength to walk away from everything she knew to protect the man she loved and the child she carried. The strength to live with a broken heart in silence to keep us safe. Her legacy is not one of willfulness, but of incredible, heartbreaking love. I looked directly at my family in the front row. Their faces were pale, a mixture of horror, shame, and disbelief. The calm facade hadn't just cracked. It had been demolished. Today we are not just mourning Alina Gable, we are mourning the truth she tried to bury, and in doing so I hope we can finally, after 40 years, honor the real victim of this story. My mother, Sarah Gable, and my father, James, the man I never got to know. I stepped down from the pulpit and walked back to my seat. The silence in the church was absolute, profound, and devastating. It was the sound of a vicious lie finally dying. In the weeks that followed, Harmony Creek buzzed. The Gables, once a symbol of respectability, became the subject of whispers. Some family members were furious, accusing me of disgracing Alina's memory. Others, like Aunt Carol, reached out with tearful apologies, finally unburdened. Our family is broken now, but it's an honest brokenness. The polished veneer is gone, and for the first time there's a chance for something real to grow in its place. The path forward is uncertain, and forgiveness feels like a distant shore I can't see yet, but I have peace. I have reclaimed my mother's story from the ashes of my grandmother's pride. Family secrets have a way of shaping us even when we don't know they exist. They're like hidden currents, pulling us in directions we don't understand. Uncovering this lie wasn't about destroying a family, it was about saving a soul, my mother's, and in the process, my own. I'm no longer just a Gable of Harmony Creek. I am the daughter of Sarah and James, a woman whose love story was finally told. My identity is no longer a footnote in someone else's story, it is a book of its own. Family secrets have a way of shaping us, even when we don't know they exist. If you have a story about uncovering a hidden truth in your own family, I would be honored if you shared it in the comments below. And if you'd like to hear more stories about finding truth in the past, please consider subscribing.